Hey everybody, Dave here with part 2 of my look and GM overview at the Sky King's Tomb Adventure Path for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you have not already viewed part 1 of this series, I encourage you to go do that now. A link to that video is in the description. Also, just as a quick reminder, I will be sharing some of my personal opinions and the pros and the cons of this campaign in this video. And I just want to make sure everybody's aware that I have not actually GM'd this campaign. I have not played it. I have only read it. So keep that in mind as I go through my more subjective parts of the video. So as usual with these part 2 videos, I'm going to start by sharing some of those personal thoughts. After that, I will address some questions that were left in the comments section of my previous video. And then at the end, I'll go into the more spoiler-heavy portion of the video. I always save to the end a review of the content that I omitted from the first video, because in that first video, I don't want to spoil everything. So to get us started, what did I like and dislike about this campaign? Overall, I feel like this is a pretty solid level 1 to level 11 campaign. I will say that it is not a very ambitious campaign. I didn't feel like there were a lot of grand surprises or twists and turns. There really wasn't anything in the narrative that shocked or surprised me. There's no grand betrayals. It's just a very solid and competent adventure. It's not fancy, but it gets the job done very well. And that kind of thematically feels appropriate for a story that is so heavily tied to the Dwarven ancestry. This is a really solid foundation. Not fancy, but it gets the job done. One of the things I really like about the Sky King's Tomb Adventure Path is that it does a great job of sharing the backstory that players will need to appreciate the overarching campaign story, and they build that directly into the adventure path. If you've been watching my other reviews and overviews, you probably know that one of the critical pieces that I encounter with a lot of adventures, not just Pathfinder, but just in the RPG tabletop hobby in general, is a lot of times there is a backstory that's integral to an adventure path or a campaign or what have you, so that you know that there was thought put into why a dungeon was built the way it was and why there's a certain ecology to it, so that you as a GM know it makes sense. But there's really no easy way to pass that backstory on to the players. Either the players have to attempt and even succeed at knowledge checks, or you have to have some sort of deus ex machina, or you have to, other games, have Captain Exposition who just drops in occasionally to say, okay, well, my players aren't really getting the backstory that they're going to need, so I'm just going to throw in this NPC in a tavern who's just going to explain it all to them. The great thing about Sky King's Tomb is not only was there a lot of thought put into the backstory and the history that drives the campaign, but they were very intentional about making sure that the players learn that backstory actively through participating through the campaign. For example, in Book 1, in the Dwarven Sky Citadel of Highhelm, there is a library/museum that the players will need to go to and participate in the Ancestors Walk. And in doing so, they will learn what they need to know about the quest for Sky. They will learn what they need to know about High King Taargick. They're going to learn all of the key pieces, not everything. There will still be some things for them to learn throughout the game, but the foundation of knowledge they will need is going to be delivered to them in a very organic way that is fit into the design of the game. And some of my other GM overviews, for example, Fist of the Ruby Phoenix, you may recall, one of my key criticisms of that was you had a big bad evil guy that the players really had no way of knowing, who this person was and what their motivations were and all this until deep, deep, deep into the final book of that campaign. Sky King's Tomb does not have those problems. Another thing that I liked, and this is one of those areas that, is not necessarily a pro or a con, it's going to be subjective to how each person feels about certain things. But I went into this thinking, like, this is the Dwarven campaign. This is the Dwarven adventure path. It's going to be all about dwarves, and it's going to be for Dwarven players, and it's going to be dwarf, dwarf, dwarf. And the first book of the campaign is very much, a Dwarven adventure in Dwarven territory. But if I look at the campaign as a whole, it feels to me less of the Dwarven campaign, and it feels more like the Darklands campaign. And not only that, but sort of a side of the Darklands we're not used to seeing. This is the first time I've ever been involved in anything in the Darklands that didn't include the Drow. So it's nice to kind of see that, there are other ancestries, other civilizations that thrive down there that are not Drow. Likewise, and this is another one of those sort of subjective pros and cons in certain ways, but a key part of the story is acknowledging that just because you live under the ground doesn't mean you're evil. And the Darklands, or the Underdark as it began in the early days of D&D, was always sort of like the evil mirror side of the regular world. So above ground you have elves and dwarves and gnomes, and underground you have evil dwarves who are called Dwagar, and you have evil elves who are called Drow, and you have evil gnomes who I can never pronounce what their proper name is, but deep gnomes or umbral gnomes, and they're just the evil gnomes. And a part of this campaign really hinges on the fact that just because you live underground doesn't mean you're evil. And that was nice to see that sort of flip side to the narrative. Now, a downside to that is, even though that is sort of one of the key pillars of the story, they don't do a great job of communicating that. For example, during your underground Darklands portions of the game, of the different communities you visit an evil Fey court, and you visit an evil dwarf city metropolis, capital city of the Heringar, who used to be known as the Dwagar. And there are the ruins of what was most likely a non-evil deep gnome settlement, but it was destroyed by the Avernal Worm. A key part of the story is the fact that High King Taargick, late in the narrative the players likely learn, even though he was celebrated as this great hero, he felt extreme guilt. He felt pretty awful about his participation in the Quest for Sky. I think modern lore says the Quest for Sky was this great crusade. It was the dwarves once upon a time lived in a paradise under the ground. It wasn't just a dwarven settlement, it was dwarven paradise. And then the god said, hey, this is the time for you to leave paradise, and you're going to have to dig up and up and up and up and up until you reach the surface world. And the dwarves that participated in that, called the Quest for Sky, became the dwarves. The dwarves who rejected that call and stayed in their paradise are the dwarves who became the Heringar, or the Grey Dwarves, the evil dwarves, so to speak. But the part of the story that I don't think is often communicated is the dwarves weren't just digging and digging and digging and digging. They were digging and digging and digging and digging right through other communities, other civilizations. They caused extreme damage to other communities that lived in the Darklands in their single-minded pursuit of achieving the quest for Sky and arriving on the surface world. And High King Taargick felt extreme guilt later in life over all of the damage that was caused to innocent people um, during the quest for Sky, and really was following the call of your god worth damaging, destroying all these innocent communities and all the people who died and were trodden underfoot from the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dwarves who marched higher and higher to the surface. So I find it interesting that that is a pillar of the story. I think it's great to see another side of the Darklands, but it would have been great if the players somewhere in this story came upon a fully functioning, good aligned underground Darklands community that could really reinforce the fact that not everybody who lives underground is evil. Instead, they spend a significant amount of time in an evil Fey city and in an evil Dark Dwarf city, and they interact with survivors from a destroyed Deep Noon city, but they don't really experience a non-evil community that's really flourishing underground. Another thing I really like about this campaign is it has a great mix of things for the players to do. Yes, there are caves to explore, there are dungeons of a sort to explore and venture through, although none of them are particularly large or like anything close to abomination vaults. These are mostly very small tombs to explore that are like, I don't know, 7 or 8 rooms, not giant sprawling dungeons. But in addition to those sort of like standard expected parts of an adventure, there's a lot of there's social encounters, there's urban exploration, there are infiltrations, there's a lot of different things kind of sprinkled in between the traditional, uh, you know, uh, dungeon delve sort of portions of the game, which I think is going to give players a great little change of pace and give them other things to focus their attentions on between the expected and standard dungeon delve parts of the game. And another part of the adventure path that I think is going to be a pro for some people and a negative for others is the pretty intense reliance upon the different subsystems that are included in the Gamemastery guide. It is very common in this campaign to have skill challenges that involve victory points, infiltration points, research points, every kind of point that is mentioned in the Gamemastery guide as like an optional subsystem is included in this game and fairly frequently. So I know there's some people out there who love these systems, and there's other people who feel like anytime you apply points to a role play, that kind of mechanical layer to the narrative can feel a little bit like it erodes your immersion. Ideally you would want to, as a player, like do things and then have the GM tell you the result, as opposed to the GM saying, okay, you earned 1 influence point for that role play you did. You still need to get 6 more in order to win this challenge. And so, okay, now we got to figure out how do we get those other points. And the existence of points like this, again, for some people, conflicts with their sense of immersion. So, for some people, this just may not be a great game due to the frequency in which the campaign engages with those sorts of systems. My take on it is I think it's less to do with using the systems and more about how, as a GM, you share those mechanics with your players. Um, I remember back in the fourth edition D&D days, where skill challenges were a hotly debated topic for this very reason. Kind of the mantra that came out of that was the first rule of skill challenges is you never tell your players they're participating in a skill challenge. And I think that philosophy holds true in Pathfinder Second Edition as well. They may be in a system or a social encounter that engages with the influence system, but you don't need to tell them the mechanics that's going on behind the scenes on the other side of the GM screen. You just needed it at the end of the allotted time for that. You just role play what the results were. Either they achieved success in that challenge or they didn't. Now the downside to that is, especially for new players who sometimes feel like they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, air quotes supposed to be doing, in order to quote win, that they can feel lost if they don't have that guidance. So I share all this just so each GM can make their own determination over whether or not engaging in those kind of systems frequently is right for you and your group. And if you do decide to engage in those systems, think ahead about what level of guidance you'll be needing to give your players. I think these work best when you give minimum to no guidance. And it's best if the players don't even know that they're earning points. So again, that's going to be for each group and each GM to figure out on their own. So let's talk about a couple of the questions that were sent in on the comments of the part 1 video. The first question has to do about the Darklands ancestries. There doesn't currently exist a Pathfinder 2nd edition guide to the Darklands. There's not a Lost Omens Darklands book the way there is for other communities within Golarion. So the question was, what ancestries get full detail write-ups? What ancestries get new information about them? What can we learn about the 2nd edition versions of Darklands society in this campaign? And the amount of information that's given in this campaign is fairly limited. There are some new names: Haringar instead of Dwagar, Drathnalar instead of Umbral or Deep Gnome, and so forth. But there's not a whole lot beyond that. There is a complete gazetteer provided for the Dark Dwarven capital city that has it's many pages. I think it's probably like 8 pages in one of the appendices that break down like what society is like there, how the law functions, and all that sort of information that you're used to seeing about other cities in Lost Omens and setting books. So there's a lot of information provided for the Dark Dwarves like that. There's another similar write-up to that in the appendix for the very last book that is for the lost dwarven city of Felgun. Felgun is the name of the paradise that the dwarves left for their quest for Sky. And there's a multi-page guide to that city as well. Beyond that, there's really not a whole lot. There is a section for people of the Darklands that gives you like a 2 to 3 sentence description of 20 different ancestries that can be encountered in the Darklands. But you basically just read that description and then you'll have to go to a bestiary or some other resource to learn more about them. There's also a little bit of description given to 3 of the layers or regions of the Darklands. And I'm bad with pronunciation, so I'm going to read this verbatim there. Narvoth, Sekamina, and Orv. And each one of those different regions of the Darklands has different traits. It does not go into these parts, these regions in great detail. There is some sort of passing mention that like with The core vault goes to the very deepest layer and things like that in sort of a general sense, but there's not a whole lot of detail given for that. So if you want information about the Dwagar, if you want information about Felgen, the ancestral city of the dwarves, there's that kind of information given, but there's really not a whole lot of concrete information given about the Darklands beyond those. Another question I was asked was, where do I rank Quest for Sky amongst the other level 1 to 11 adventure paths, and would I consider Quest for Sky a good adventure path for new GMs? So, first of all, so far I've only read one other level 1 to 11 adventure path that was Abomination Vaults. Um, and I view Abomination Vaults and Sky King's Tomb pretty similar. Um, I think I give the edge to Abomination Vaults overall, but I think there is a large and growing community of players out there who don't enjoy nonstop or almost nonstop dungeon crawls like you encounter in Abomination Vaults. And so for those people, Sky King Tombs would be a great bet. Abomination Vaults has an extra feather in his cap for new players and new GMs because it rides on the coattails of the Otari stories that are in the beginner's box. So you can introduce players with the beginner's box and then go right into Abomination Vaults, and they very organically fit. Whereas there's not a lead-in like that for Sky King's Tomb. But that said, I do feel that Sky King's Tomb is probably a great adventure path for new GMs and for new players. Earlier on in this video, I think I mentioned that the story is pretty competent and solid. There's not a lot of twists and turns and narrative surprises. It is just like feels like a nice, sturdy, solid story, but it's not ambitious at all. And even though that may dissuade experienced GMs from wanting to run this, I think that makes it an ideal adventure path for new GMs. So if you're going to be trying Pathfinder 2nd Edition for the first time, and you suspect your players may not want to commit to long-term dungeon crawls with Abomination Vaults, then Sky King Tomb is probably a great bet for you. So now we're going to dive into the spoilers that I omitted from my Part 1 video. And there's really not a lot. Kind of goes along with the fact that there's not a lot of surprises in the story. There really wasn't a lot of like spoiler that I felt like I should withhold from the first video. But there are two pieces, and the first of those is about the Avernal Worm. The Avernal Worm is painted as either this force of nature, this destructive force of nature underground, or something evil like Rovagug that just wants to destroy. The reality is, the Avernal Worm, whose name is Zogotaru, is intelligent. And she is not evil, not as I would consider evil. And she is a friend of High King Taargick's. She is his last dearest friend. And the story in general is High King Taargick, at the end of his reign, he felt very guilty for his role in the Quest for Sky and the damages that were caused by the Quest for Sky. So he rejected the grand tomb that was crafted by his people, and he instead went into the Darklands by himself to find a place where he could build his own tomb quietly, away from Dwarven society, and he would entomb himself there peacefully. While he was digging, the great worm Zogotaru heard him and came to investigate and saw a dwarf and became angry and attacked him. They fought for several days, at the end of which High King Taargick was the victor, but he couldn't bring himself to kill any more residents of the Darklands. So he threw down his weapon, he spared Zogotaru, the worm's life, and the two of them developed a profound respect for each other and a profound friendship during High King Taargick's final days. After the High King died, now many years later, Um, I think 10 years before the start of this campaign, a young dwarf named Krohan steals High King Taargick's clan dagger, believing that he is chosen to be a great hero, and he goes into the Darklands with the clan dagger, preparing to do acts of great heroism. And because he's young and foolish, he fumbles and he loses the dagger. And long story short, that dagger is found by some deep gnomes. And the deep gnomes, or Drathnalar, don't understand the significance of it, but they do see that there's a nice big shiny gem attached to the pommel of the dagger, and they break out that gem, seeing value in that gem. And when they do so, there's sort of like a psychic or spiritual reverberation as this like holy relic is defiled, and Zogotaru, the Avernal worm, hears that, and it sends her into sort of a berserk feral nature, and that's why she destroys the Deep Gnome's city. It wasn't an act of pure conscious evil or destruction for the sake of destruction exactly. It was a reaction to this sacred relic of her long dear friend being defiled. So I guess that's the first part, is to understand that Zogotaru is not evil, is not the villain of the story. And at the end of the story, when the players finally encounter Narsagus, the villain of the story, he has enslaved the minds of all of Zogotaru's children, and is in the middle of kind of wresting the last bit of control from Zogotaru herself. And so the players engage Narsagus in a grand climactic battle, while also trying to not kill her children that are attacking them because they're being controlled by Narsagus, and also having to deal with a rampaging worm who is trying to fight the control of this evil sorcerer. That occurs at the beginning of the last chapter of the campaign. So our climactic battle is not the finale. It happens at the beginning of the third chapter. After the players have dealt with that, they have a great opportunity to befriend Zogotaru and to learn her backstory and her role. And she even, once they prove that they are friends of the spirit of High King Taargick, she agrees to excavate his tomb. His tomb was completely buried for safety, and she, being a giant worm, has no problem just chewing away probably hundreds of feet of solid stone to unearth, so to speak, the tomb. And the bulk of the final chapter is the players entering the tomb, where they encounter angels who were sent from heaven to protect the tomb from robbers, and they ultimately sort of magically engage with memories from High King Taargick that describe and illustrate his challenges rising to power and leading the quest for Sky, both sort of social encounters where he had to hold the dwarves together when there were mutinies and disagreements from leaders, and it was all going to fragment apart. And they have to kind of relive and play his role in some combat as well. And at the end of it, they will have experienced the true breadth of the king's story, of who he really was, and not just who was painted as an epic hero by the legends and stories. And the grand prize isn't a vault of coins and powerful magic weapons and so on and so forth. The final treasure is a map to Felgun, the paradise that the dwarves left, that shows every single path that was dug by the dwarves, every single Darklands community they had to dig through, and it also shows a secret passage that may still be accessible into the dwarven paradise of Felgun. So that's sort of a plot thread that's left for the future. I don't know if they're planning to do another adventure path that would be, levels 11 through 20 that explores returning to the ancestral home of the dwarves, but that is the ultimate prize that is found at the end. So there you have it. Those are my general thoughts about the Sky King's Tomb adventure path. I think it's a very solid but not particularly ambitious adventure path. Pretty good for new GM, new players, level 1 to 11. If you have any questions about anything that I've shared, please leave those in the comments below. And as always, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody out there who supports this channel, whether that's by clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, subscribing to the Patreon, buying a super thanks. I really appreciate everything you folks do to support me. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming!